At 12:43 in the morning on July 5, 1943, a lieutenant standing on the bridge of a United States destroyer saw a thin phosphorescent line cutting through the black water of Kula Gulf. He reached for the intercom and began to shout an emergency turn order. He managed one word. The explosion came before he could finish the second. The torpedo struck the port side of the USS Strong in way of the forward fire room at frame 90, and the ship that had been commissioned 332 days earlier began to die in the darkness between two enemy-held islands in the Solomon Chain. No submarine had been detected. No surface contact appeared on radar. No ship was visible anywhere on the horizon. The torpedo had traveled an estimated 19,000 to 22,000 yards through open water, roughly 11 nautical miles, running in a straight line for at least 15 minutes before it found the Strong. During that time, the Strong had changed course 3 times. She still crossed the path of the salvo. When Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth and his staff reviewed what had happened, they initially concluded that no surface-launched torpedo could have crossed that distance. They attributed the hit to an enemy submarine operating undetected in the Gulf. They were wrong. The weapon that killed the Strong was not fired from beneath the water. It was fired from the deck of a Japanese destroyer that the Americans never saw, at a range the United States Navy considered technically impossible. And the most unsettling part of this story is not that the Japanese had built such a weapon. It is that the Americans had been told about it 3 years before it sank the Strong, and chose not to believe it. The USS Strong, hull number DD-467, was a Fletcher-class destroyer, the new backbone of the American surface fleet in the Pacific. The Fletchers were the first generation of destroyers designed after the expiration of the naval treaties that had limited warship construction through the 1930s. They displaced roughly 2,100 tons standard, stretched 376 feet from bow to stern, and carried 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns in single mounts, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple centerline launchers, depth charge racks, and K-gun depth charge projectors. Their twin-geared steam turbines produced 60,000 shaft horsepower and pushed them past 36 knots in calm water. They were fast, heavily armed for their size, and long-legged enough to operate across the vast distances of the Pacific theater. 175 Fletcher-class destroyers would be built during the war, more than any other destroyer class in American history. 19 would be lost in action. The Strong was the 7th commissioned and would become the 2nd to go down. She had been laid down at Bath Iron Works in Maine in 1941, alongside the Chevalier, and commissioned on August 7, 1942. Her only commanding officer was Commander Joseph Harold Wellings, 40 years old, an Annapolis graduate from the class of 1925 whom the crew called Gus. Wellings had recruited many of his officers from New England, and the ship drew much of her enlisted strength from the same region. The combination produced a crew of unusual cohesion, a ship whose men held her in a regard that went well beyond routine service attachment. After the Strong sank, her survivors circulated a petition requesting the Navy to commission a new USS Strong and assign the same officers and crew to serve together again. The petition was denied. But its existence says something about what Wellings had built aboard that destroyer in less than a year of war. By February 1943, the Strong was operating in the Solomon Islands, supporting patrols, convoy escorts, and shore bombardment missions as the American advance pushed northwest through the island chain after the conclusion of the Guadalcanal campaign. On the night of July 4, she was part of Ainsworth's Task Force 18, operating as Task Group 36.1, built around the light cruisers Honolulu, Helena, and St. Louis, with Destroyer Division 41 providing the screen. The mission was to bombard Japanese positions in support of troop landings at Rice Anchorage on the northern coast of New Georgia, part of the broader New Georgia campaign to seize the Japanese airstrip at Munda. The entire landmass surrounding Kula Gulf was held by the enemy. Japanese shipping moved through these waters regularly, reinforcing and resupplying the garrison at Munda. 2 weeks earlier, ships of this same squadron had made a similar bombardment run in these same waters, which meant the element of surprise was no longer available. The Japanese knew the Americans were using the Gulf and had every reason to be prepared. The Gulf was a corridor barely 20 miles long and 5 miles wide at its narrowest, flanked by Kolombangara to the west and New Georgia to the east, with Japanese positions on both shores. The column formed in order: Nicholas, Strong, Honolulu, Helena, St. Louis, O'Bannon, and Chevalier. The Strong held the second position, directly ahead of the three cruisers, the most exposed slot in the formation. Shortly after midnight, she commenced firing and put approximately 300 rounds of 5-inch ammunition into targets around Bairoko Harbor on the northern shore of New Georgia. A PBY Black Cat spotter aircraft reported good results. At approximately 34 minutes past midnight, the firing ceased. The column altered course to due north to exit Kula Gulf. The bombardment was over. The mission, by every measure available at that moment, had succeeded. The crew of the Strong had no reason to believe the most dangerous part of the night was still ahead. The weapon that found them in the dark had been under development for 15 years. The Type 93 torpedo, known after the war by the name American naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison gave it, the Long Lance, was not a response to any single technological gap. It was the centerpiece of a strategic doctrine that predated radar, sonar, and the war itself. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood that it would enter any future conflict with fewer capital ships than the United States. Japanese war planning, built around the assumption that an American fleet would eventually push across the Pacific to relieve or recapture the Philippines, called for light forces, primarily destroyers and cruisers, to reduce the advancing fleet in a series of attritional engagements before the decisive surface battle that both navies expected. The torpedo was the only weapon that gave a 2,000-ton destroyer the theoretical ability to cripple or sink a 35,000-ton battleship. If that torpedo could be made to outrange and outperform anything the enemy possessed, it would become a strategic equalizer, allowing Japanese destroyers to strike and withdraw before the Americans could close to effective gun range. The engineering problem was propulsion. Conventional torpedoes used compressed air to burn kerosene or a similar fuel. Air is only 21% oxygen. The remaining 78%, mostly inert nitrogen, contributes nothing to combustion and produces a visible trail of bubbles that rises to the surface, marking the torpedo's track for any lookout watching the water. Japanese engineers, working under Rear Admiral Kaneji Kishimoto and Captain Toshihide Asakuma, beginning in 1928, spent years solving the problem of substituting pure compressed oxygen for air. Oxygen under compression is violently unstable, and early experiments produced lethal detonations that killed technicians and destroyed test facilities. The breakthrough came when they discovered that starting the engine on compressed air and gradually transitioning to pure oxygen as the combustion chamber warmed prevented the catastrophic ignition that had defeated every earlier attempt. The result was a weapon that carried nearly 5 times the effective oxidizer in the same tank volume, extending range dramatically while producing an exhaust composed almost entirely of water vapor and carbon dioxide, both of which dissolved rapidly into the surrounding seawater. The bubble trail, the one reliable warning that a torpedo was coming, nearly vanished. The secrecy around the program was so extreme that the oxygen tank aboard each torpedo was labeled the secondary air tank, concealing its true nature even from the Japanese sailors who loaded the weapons into their tubes. The finished weapon was enormous by the standards of any navy. The Type 93 measured over 9 meters in length, weighed approximately 2,700 kilograms, and carried a warhead of 490 kilograms of high explosive, more than 30% heavier than the American Mark 15's warhead. At its most economical speed, 36 knots, it could travel 40,000 meters, more than 21 nautical miles. At its fastest, exceeding 48 knots, it covered 22,000 meters, roughly 12 nautical miles. The Mark 15, by contrast, had a maximum range of approximately 14,000 meters at 26 knots and was typically employed at distances well inside 5 nautical miles. No Allied torpedo came close to matching the Long Lance in range, speed, or discretion. In the close-quarters night engagements of the Solomon Islands, where visibility was measured in hundreds of yards and ships fought at ranges where muzzle flashes lit the horizon, the Long Lance's extreme reach and near-invisible wake made it the most dangerous surface-launched weapon in any navy on Earth. But the most consequential fact about the Long Lance is not what it could do. It is what the Americans knew and refused to accept. In 1940, 3 years before the Strong went down, a Japanese walk-in source provided the United States naval attache in Tokyo with detailed information describing the Type 93 oxygen torpedo and its capabilities. The intelligence was forwarded to the Office of Naval Intelligence and from there to the Bureau of Ordnance for technical evaluation. The Bureau examined the reported specifications, the extraordinary range, the oxygen propulsion, the near-invisible wake, and dismissed them as technically implausible. No navy in the world operated a torpedo with those characteristics. American engineers had considered and rejected oxygen propulsion as too dangerous for shipboard use. The Bureau concluded that the source was either mistaken or deliberately exaggerating. No alert was issued. No tactical guidance was updated. The operational fleet received no warning. For the next 3 years, American commanders in the Pacific fought a series of brutal night surface actions in the Solomons against an enemy armed with a weapon whose reach they did not comprehend. Ships were struck at distances that defied every assumption about torpedo warfare. Officers attributed the hits to undetected submarines, to mines, to accidents of geography. The Office of Naval Intelligence would eventually describe the Type 93 as probably the most radical and spectacular development encountered in the Pacific theater. But that assessment came only after intact examples were captured and examined in 1943, and only after ships had already been lost to a weapon that had been reported, forwarded through channels, and filed away as impossible. At some point between midnight and 12:30 on the morning of July 5, 3 Japanese destroyers entered the northern approaches to Kula Gulf. They were Nizuki, Nagatsuki, and Unagi, elements of a Tokyo Express force tasked with delivering reinforcements to Japanese garrisons in the Central Solomons. A 4th destroyer, Satsuki, was also present but did not fire torpedoes that night. Nizuki, an Akizuki-class destroyer equipped with her own search radar, detected the American formation and provided the targeting data to the group. The 3 ships launched a combined salvo of 14 torpedoes at long range into the projected path of Ainsworth's column. Then they withdrew before Ainsworth's formation could identify or engage them. The torpedoes ran straight through the dark water of the Gulf. They did not track. They did not home. They were ballistic weapons, aimed at a patch of ocean where the target formation was calculated to be when the weapons arrived, minutes later, miles away. The Strong, steaming north at the head of the cruiser column, had changed her heading 3 times since the bombardment ended, turning from the firing course to the retirement course and adjusting for the movements of the formation through the narrow gulf. Despite those course changes, at least 1 torpedo from the salvo intersected the Strong's path at 12:43. Sonarman second-class Jack Haley had already reported the anomaly. His underwater sound equipment was picking up extremely loud noises from multiple directions, sounds he described as resembling locomotives traveling at tremendous speed. They came from the starboard bow, from forward of the port beam, and from the starboard quarter simultaneously, as if the sea itself were roaring from every direction at once. Haley told the Combat Information Center that the noises did not match any training records, but he would bet there were some very large torpedoes in the water, moving fast. The executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Purdy, stepped into the CIC, noted that the noises seemed loudest from the direction of Rice Anchorage, where American troops were landing, and concluded they were associated with the landing operation. He stepped out of the chart room onto the bridge. Seconds later, the gunnery officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert Curran, standing on the port side, saw the phosphorescent wake cutting toward the ship. He switched to the JA circuit and shouted the beginning of an emergency turn order. The word he got out was left. The explosion erased the rest. The torpedo struck at frame 90, amidships on the port side. The blast tore open the hull across the forward fire room and the forward engine room simultaneously. The keel broke. Main power failed instantly throughout the ship, though emergency power came on after a momentary delay and held. The SG radar returned on emergency power, operating on relative bearings because the gyro input was lost. Internal communications, the sound-powered telephones that did not depend on electrical power, functioned to most stations, but the structural damage was beyond any repair that could be made afloat. The forward fire room was destroyed, flooded in seconds. The bulkhead between the forward fire room and the forward engine room was blown away. Seams opened on the starboard side of the bulkhead between the forward engine room and the after fire room, and seawater poured through into the lower level. The deck plates buckled across a 30-frame span amidships. The superstructure collapsed on the port side between the after face of the No. 1 stack and the forward torpedo mount. The number 2 motor whaleboat was torn apart, one half dangling from the forward davit. The Strong took an immediate starboard list that worsened steadily, passing 15 degrees, then 20, then climbing toward 40. In the after-engine room, Lieutenant Junior Grade R.E. Frost, the assistant engineering officer, secured the space for potential towing, engaging the jacking gear and sealing the bulkhead stops, but the ship was breaking apart beneath him. On the shores of New Georgia, Japanese coastal batteries found the range. Star shells burst over the crippled destroyer, illuminating her for the gunners ashore. Shells began falling around the Strong, placing her and any ship that attempted to approach in direct danger. The O'Bannon turned her guns toward the coast and began returning fire to suppress the batteries, while the rest of the column continued north. Commander Wellings directed the evacuation from the bridge with the composure that every surviving account describes in identical terms: calm, methodical, unhurried. He gave the order to prepare to abandon ship, but he did not give the order to abandon until the last possible moment, holding off as long as any chance of saving the ship or additional men remained. The gunnery officer ordered all guns to hold fire unless he personally designated a target, preventing any misdirected shooting in the confusion. External communications were dead, every transmitter knocked out by the blast, but a flashing light message was sent to the Chevalier and relayed to the task group commander. The Strong was sinking. She needed help. And help came from a ship that had been built in the same yard, launched from the same ways, and assigned to the same destroyer division. The Chevalier's commanding officer, Commander Ephraim R. McLean, Jr., brought his destroyer alongside the Strong's port side, placing her bow against the sinking ship and creating a temporary bridge between the two hulls. The accounts of exactly how the contact occurred differ in their details. Some describe a deliberate approach. Others suggest the motion of the ships in the dark water and the confusion of the moment contributed to the severity of the contact. What is beyond dispute is what McLean did once the two ships were together. He accepted the risk of holding his own destroyer against a sinking vessel under active fire from shore batteries, with armed depth charges aboard the Strong that could detonate at any moment. His crew threw cargo nets and lines between the two hulls. Men scrambled across the narrow gap between the ships, climbing over railings, sliding down ropes, dropping onto the Chevalier's deck, hauled aboard by hands reaching out in the darkness. In approximately 7 minutes, 241 men, 234 enlisted and 7 officers, crossed from the Strong to the Chevalier. The transfer was not orderly. It was desperate and physical, driven by the plain knowledge that the Strong was going down. The shore batteries were still firing, and the depth charges below had not been disarmed. On the Strong's forecastle, Lieutenant Commander Purdy, the executive officer, and Lieutenant Junior Grade Milton Hackett, the torpedo officer, remained forward with Ensign Jack Howard, working to get as many additional men across as possible. They were still pulling sailors toward the Chevalier when McLean was forced to back away. The Strong was settling too fast. The risk to a second ship could no longer be sustained. As the Chevalier separated by a few yards, the Strong's starboard list exceeded 45 degrees. The main deck was awash. Commander Wellings attempted to descend the outside ladder from the bridge to the superstructure deck, but found the water already too high. He went back to the starboard wing of the bridge and stepped from the windscreen outboard of the starboard torpedo director into the sea. Chief Quartermaster L.A. Rodriguez, who had remained with Wellings throughout the entire ordeal, went with him. Shortly after Wellings and Rodriguez entered the water, the Strong broke apart, the after section twisting to starboard as the hull separated. Wellings was approximately 25 yards from the ship, floating on his back in a Kapok life jacket, when the depth charges detonated. The concussion tore through the water with tremendous force. Wellings lost consciousness. Rodriguez, already severely injured, absorbed the full violence of the underwater blast. Aboard the Chevalier, the explosions destroyed the ship's radar and sonar equipment, leaving McLean partially blind as he withdrew under fire into the darkness of the Gulf. For his actions that night, McLean would receive the Navy Cross. The Strong sank at approximately 1:22 in the morning, roughly 40 minutes after the torpedo hit. 46 of her crew were dead. The rest, approximately 280 men, were scattered. The majority aboard the Chevalier, but others in the water clinging to floater nets and wreckage in the dark, oil-covered surface of Kula Gulf, drifting with the current between enemy-held shores. The torpedo hit is frequently attributed to Niizuki, but surviving records do not rule out Nagatsuki or Unagi as the ship that launched the weapon that found the Strong. The distance was so great, and the Japanese withdrawal so swift, that definitive attribution has never been established. It remains one of the longest confirmed torpedo hits in naval history, and widely regarded as the longest. Wellings and Rodriguez found each other in the darkness, guided by the intermittent illumination of Japanese star shells still bursting over the area. They reached a floater net drifting nearby. The current running through Kula Gulf was strong, pushing steadily south toward Arundel Island and the Blackett Strait, toward enemy-held territory. Throughout the remaining hours of darkness, they collected 3 more survivors. Lieutenant Junior Grade Keith N. Shirley, the ship's supply officer, barely 6 months in the Navy after graduating from Harvard, and 2 enlisted men. The 5 of them spent the rest of the night fighting the current, trying to hold their position near where the Strong had gone down rather than drifting toward the enemy coast. Shirley later recalled that one of the enlisted men argued against swimming ashore, insisting that the Navy would search the area at dawn, and that their best chance of rescue was to stay near the oil slick and the wreckage. The argument held. They stayed in the water, pulling the floater net against the current through the long hours, resting only in brief intervals when exhaustion forced them to stop and hang from the net's ropes. Wellings drifted in and out of consciousness, his internal injuries from the depth charge blast worsening with each hour in the water. Rodriguez, despite his own severe wounds, remained alert enough to perform the act that ultimately saved all 5 lives. In the first gray light before dawn, he identified a silhouette on the horizon by its profile as a United States Navy destroyer, the USS Gwin. One of the men in the water produced a standard-issue steel Navy flashlight that had somehow survived the sinking and the hours of immersion in salt water and fuel oil. Against every reasonable expectation, it worked. Rodriguez aimed it at the distant silhouette and signaled. The message was 2 words: strong survivors. The Gwin turned toward them. At approximately 5:10 in the morning, more than 4 hours after the Strong went down, the 5 men were pulled from the water. Wellings had to be carried up the cargo net and onto the deck. The Silver Star citation he later received recorded that he had calmly and efficiently directed the abandonment of his sinking ship, remaining aboard as she went down. Rodriguez was hospitalized for his injuries. He survived the immediate aftermath, but according to survivor accounts, he died weeks later in his sleep from an undiagnosed cerebral blood clot. His death occurred after the initial casualty reports had been completed. He is not counted among the 46 men listed as killed in the sinking of the Strong. While Wellings and his small group fought the current through the night, a second group of survivors had drifted in the opposite direction. More than 20 men, including Lieutenant Hugh Barr Miller Jr., had been unable to reach the Chevalier during the 7 minutes of rescue, and were now being carried south by the same powerful current that Wellings had spent the night resisting. Miller was 33 years old, born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a former quarterback on the University of Alabama's Crimson Tide, who had helped lead the undefeated 1930 squad to the 1931 Rose Bowl. His shipmates aboard the Strong had called him Rose Bowl. He had joined the Navy before the war and served as Strong's machine gun officer. During the sinking, Miller helped free 2 trapped sailors and kept them afloat until he could place them on a net. The detonation of the depth charges caught him in the water and caused severe internal injuries. For 3 days, Miller and the surviving members of his group drifted on damaged rafts and floater nets across the open water south of the sinking site. Several of the more severely wounded died during the drift. Miller sent the fittest men ahead in the remaining usable rafts to seek help from American forces. After approximately 3 days, about 6 survivors, Miller among them, reached a small islet. Another man died there. Miller and 4 remaining companions managed to make their way to Arundel Island, larger and with fresh water and coconuts, but they quickly discovered that Japanese troops occupied the island in considerable strength. Patrols crossed the interior regularly. Miller's condition continued to deteriorate. His wounds were infected, his mobility limited, his pain constant. By July 15, 10 days after the torpedo, he was convinced that his injuries made him a liability to the group and that his presence would endanger the others. He ordered the 3 remaining enlisted men to take his boots and knife and leave him behind. They resisted. He insisted. He told them he believed he was dying and that their only chance was to move without him. They left, heading across a nearby sound toward the American lines on New Georgia. Miller gave them directions based on what he knew of the coastline. They were never heard from again. Miller expected to die on Arundel. He did not. His condition stabilized and then, slowly, improbably improved. He began to move through the undergrowth, carefully, searching for food and water, and avoiding the Japanese patrols that crisscrossed the island daily. On August 3, nearly a month after the sinking, he found the body of a Japanese soldier washed ashore on a beach and recovered a bayonet, socks, shoes, some tinned beef, and 2 hand grenades. The following night, he threw 1 grenade into the middle of an enemy patrol that had come too close to his hiding place. Between August 9 and August 14, using additional grenades recovered from the bodies of dead Japanese soldiers and from enemy troops washed ashore on the island's beaches, Miller attacked several shoreline machine gun positions. He was alone, wounded, armed only with what he could take from the dead, on an island occupied by enemy forces, and he was fighting back. On the morning of August 16, 43 days after the torpedo that destroyed the USS Strong, a low-flying American torpedo bomber spotted Miller on a beach on Arundel Island. Within an hour, a Marine rescue team arrived in a J-2F Duck amphibious biplane, landed on calm water near the shore, rowed in on an inflatable boat, and pulled him out. He was evacuated first to a forward aid station on New Georgia, then to the Fleet Hospital at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. On September 15, 1943, Admiral William F. Halsey personally presented Miller with the Navy Cross in a ceremony witnessed by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was touring Pacific installations at the time. The citation recorded 39 days of isolated survival behind enemy lines. Miller had been twice recommended for the Medal of Honor, but it was never granted. He carried the physical consequences of the torpedo and the depth charges for the rest of his life. He died in 1978 at the age of 68. Barely more than a day after the Strong went down, the same water took a second toll. On the night of July 5 into July 6, Rear Admiral Ainsworth brought Task Group 36.1 back into Kula Gulf to intercept another Tokyo Express run. 10 Japanese destroyers carrying 2,600 troops and commanded by Rear Admiral Teruo Akiyama aboard the Nizuki entered the Gulf from the north. Ainsworth's cruisers, tracking the enemy formation by radar, opened fire at 1:57 in the morning. 612 shells fell on the Japanese column in 21 minutes. The Nizuki was destroyed. Akiyama was killed aboard her, along with approximately 300 of her crew, but the Long Lance struck again. During the engagement, Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes into the American formation, and 3 of them found the light cruiser Helena. She had expended all her flashless powder during the previous night's bombardment and was forced to fire with smokeless powder, illuminating herself to every Japanese ship in the Gulf with every salvo she fired. The 3 Long Lances broke her into 3 pieces. She sank with nearly 170 of her crew. Ainsworth had developed his night fighting doctrine around radar-directed gunnery, closing to 8,000 to 10,000 yards to maximize the accuracy of his cruiser's 6-inch guns. That distance placed his ship squarely inside the engagement envelope of the weapon he still did not fully understand. The lesson of the Strong. The lesson that a Japanese torpedo could kill from 11 miles away, and that closing to standard gunnery range put American cruisers well within the Long Lance's reach, had not been absorbed in time to save the Helena. The consequences radiating outward from that single torpedo hit on July 5 did not end with the Helena. The Chevalier, the ship that had placed herself against the Strong's hull and taken 241 men to safety in 7 minutes, survived the night of the Strong's loss with her radar and sonar destroyed but her crew intact. 3 months later, on October 6, 1943, off Vella La Vella in the same island chain, the Chevalier intercepted a force of Japanese destroyers evacuating troops. She was struck by a torpedo from the Japanese destroyer Yugumo. The blast severed her bow. The O'Bannon, maneuvering in the darkness behind her, collided with her amidships. The crew abandoned ship. To prevent capture, the USS La Valette sank the Chevalier with an American torpedo. 54 of her men died. The ship that saved the Strong was herself destroyed in the same waters, by the same kind of weapon, within the same campaign, and finished at the end by a torpedo fired from one of her own. In February 2019, The research vessel Petrel located the wreck of the USS Strong resting nearly 1,000 feet below the surface of the southern Kula Gulf. The expedition had specifically searched for her because the circumstances of her loss are believed to represent one of the longest successful torpedo hits ever recorded. She lies in the dark at the bottom of the Gulf she was bombarding when the weapon found her, one of 175 Fletcher-class destroyers built during the war, one of 19 lost, the second of her class to sink. 11 nautical miles separated the Japanese destroyer from the USS Strong on the night of July 5, 1943. 3 years separated the intelligence report about the Long Lance from the operational understanding of what it could do. 43 days separated Hugh Barr Miller from the torpedo that destroyed his ship and the amphibious biplane that pulled him off a beach on Arundel Island. In each case, the distance was the story. The distance between the weapon and its target, between knowledge and belief, between the moment a ship broke apart in the dark and the moment the last of her crew came home. The war in the Pacific was not won only by courage or by the staggering output of American shipyards and factories, though both were indispensable. It was won, in part, by closing the distance between what the enemy could do and what the United States was willing to accept as real. For the men of the Strong, that distance was measured first in yards, then in hours, then in days. And for 46 of them, it was never closed at all. If you had been on Ainsworth's staff that morning, holding a report that said torpedo, a sonar contact that suggested submarine, and no identified surface attacker, would you have reached the same conclusion? Tell us what evidence would have convinced you. Subscribe to Steel and Rations for more extraordinary stories from the war against Japan.